Welcome back to my channel. My name is Brian Kafiki, and in this video I'm continuing a series called Use Python for Everything. The first video laid out the use case for why you should use Python for everything. In this video I'm going to take a close look at specifically how you can use Python to develop web applications. And I'm of course drinking out of my Python mug, fully branded with my Python shirt. So let's jump in. So where are we going in this presentation? I'm going to start by talking about frameworks, specifically web frameworks, what they are, and what are the best frameworks available for Python. Now I'm going to talk about some of the two of the really top ones, but I also want to discuss runner-ups. Typically in any kind of competition there's the ones that win, but there's also ones that came close. In this particular case, the runner-ups are not necessarily worse, they're just different. And in my particular way of evaluating, I put them a little further down, but I want you to consider them. But the two I will talk about the most are the most popular and give us a really good starting point. I'll also talk about the strengths of using Python as a web and mobile app development language, and I'll talk about the limitations or weaknesses. Now, when we talk about using Python for everything, I did cover this a little more in my last video, but just to highlight, we're talking about web, mobile apps, desktop apps, data and AI, automation, games, and as a student language. And I think the student language needs a little explanation. What I mean is that when a language is really good for people to start learning, that's really key to the language in general. The people who, when you start with a certain language, there's a tendency to want to stick with it. And I know myself, I started on BASIC, and it took me a long time to want to do a different language. I have done many languages over time, but I still have a soft place in my heart. That was my Boston accent coming out. But I do have a soft place in my heart for the basic programming language, and of course Microsoft has been very big with that, with Visual Basic, etc. over the years. Python is probably the most popular starting language for programmers, and it is not considered the most heavy-duty, complex to learn, which I think is a huge strength. So I will talk about that in a different video, but today we're going to talk about web and mobile apps. Let's start by, what is a framework? A framework is something that gives you a jump start in your development and in your maintenance. Now the development is the key thing. You want to build something. In this case, we want to build a web app. A web app has certain unique requirements that don't necessarily fit other applications. For one thing, it's going to communicate between a client machine and a server using the HTTP or HTTPS protocol. It has certain needs too. It needs to support things like GET and POST types of requests, and there's a kind of a structure around it that wouldn't fit something like, say, a GUI app for a desktop app. So this is key. The ability for that framework to really help you both in getting started, but also in the long-term maintenance, is really crucial. Another area that typically comes up in the framework is sort of a conceptual paradigm around which you conceive of the application and how you're developing and how it's going to actually function. Now, part of this, sometimes really a bit synonymous, is called design patterns. Web frameworks are very central to this idea, and one concept you'll see a lot is something called the model view controller paradigm. There's some slight variations on that, but it's a general way to see that what you're presenting and what you're coding to behave on that presentation and all those things, how they fit together. Paradigms are really key to frameworks, and I'd say nowhere more important than when it comes to web apps, because there's a lot going on. Another thing that most frameworks will do is provide an overall project structure, a way to organize your project. Now this varies, and what people really want and how much of that, especially how rigid it is a key consideration for frameworks. Being somebody who is not really a heavy-duty web developer, I like a lot of structure, so I'm okay with that. Some people prefer less forced on structure, but definitely providing something, a structure. Where do you put your config files? Where does your code go? Where's the modules and packages that are being used to extend the application, etc.? That's important, and you need to consider that. A key thing too is, I'm a lazy programmer. You should be too. I say that a lot. So finding one that provides a lot of built-in services that save you the work of developing that or save you the pain of not having them, like debugging tools and things, is really important. So having services like security that's built in, uh, meaning you can actually register users, authorize what they can do. A built-in dev web server is a nice feature to have. Logging, debugging, profiling tools, there's all these things you can get. That's going to save you a lot of work. I mean, if I could have it just, I tell it what I want and it would build the app for me and it did just what I want, it'd have to read my mind, I would go with that. But in lieu of that, this is the best you can get. Also needs to grow with your app. What do I mean by that? You're going to start out with something, and if you've done development for a while, as I have, the requirements always change. Very often something that started as nothing more than a prototype goes into production, and I have to support that and now extend it. With some frameworks, if it's done well, that's not a problem. I can easily extend it, build it out, and it'll let me develop and grow with it. Some paradigms are more limited, and so you may find that as a problem. Now with the Python frameworks, not as much of an issue, but there are some key differentiators that I'll highlight. So to give you a sense of where am I coming from when I actually, it's a while back, evaluated what's the best web app, in particular framework I wanted to look at. And then I looked at mobile app, and there's only one choice, so that's easy. At least all that I know of, there's one basic choice. But in web apps, there's a lot of choices. I had a specific goal in mind. I pictured myself like, and like, and like, and the idea was I kept seeing, if you're like me, you see people selling their company and making $1 trillion with something like, whether it's Twitter or Tumblr or whatever, and I want to write that killer app. And in that evaluation, which is still in progress, by the way, these are the things I thought of as important. Now, the number one criteria is I am a single person on a shoestring budget. I'm not a mega corporation that can afford to spend a lot on licensing fees and services. So that's a key element. I want this to do as much for me as possible. I mean, I want to build this app fast. I don't want to have to write low-level functions and services that I might be able to get provided for me. I'm okay with it organizing my code as long as the way it's organizing it makes sense and is easy to support. Extensibility, kind of going back with doing as much as possible. I may find there's pieces that I didn't think of I want to add in, and I want to be able to do that easily. I also, again, the shoestring budget comes in. I want it to be free and cross-platform. So those are my criteria. I'm pointing this out for two reasons. One, define what your criteria are for what you're writing. If you're a big corporation and you're trying to pick what to use, that's a very different set of requirements than what I have. If you're trying to write a killer app like I am, then maybe this is a good thing. Think about what you're trying to do. That's always going to be key. The other thing is so that when you see how I evaluate things, you realize this is the sort of way I'm seeing it. So you will understand that this is what I'm prioritizing and it may not fit yours. So let me jump in. My answer for what I wanted was Django. I'll talk about that in more detail. So let's jump in. Django is a very extensive, all-encompassing web development framework. I kind of come from more of the Microsoft tools background, so it reminded me a lot of ASP.NET. But there's also things like JSP and things, and it is that sort of scripting back end that sends a web page back. That's how Django is designed. It's not designed to really do, it's not JavaScript, so it won't run Python in the browser. There are tricks and tools I'll talk about that can do that, but Django is really that back-end server, web client type of architecture. It includes a full web development framework. It includes also its own version of a database object relational mapper. It has built-in security administration, and I don't mean just like you can authorize things. I mean actual screens where you can put in a user, you can say what they can do, you can authorize your apps, etc. Saves you a lot of grief, and it's nice to have that. But it also has ways to authenticate that when somebody gets a page that it doesn't let somebody attack and get to like those man-in-the-middle attacks, etc. That's really good because you don't imagine you write something, and this is something I could certainly do. I wrote it all and didn't even think about security, and then suddenly I have a problem. My app's getting hacked, and I don't have a good quick solution. I also want it to be highly extensible. And in this case, Django is highly extensible. It supports Bootstrap, and if you ever heard of Bootstrap, it's just a way to really like customize the way things are visualized. It's kind of sort of a layer on top of CSS that lets, because cascading style sheets that let you colorize, format, and things, and you can just make a world of difference just laying Bootstrap templates over things. So it's huge. And on and on. Django has actually got a lot of stuff, and I want to say one more thing about the ORM. It's a very extensive ORM that's built into Django, very powerful, and lets you pretty much do anything you'd want to do, and it can all be in Python code, which is great. And let me just click on this link. Another great thing about Django is it's extremely well documented. You will have no trouble learning what you need to know in Django. I'm going to talk about a couple of books, but you can see here, I mean, I can go right in here. I got an overview, got a tutorial. It gives you code samples. It's really nice, and you can see it is a very organized type of setup. It's well thought out. I tend to be very logical minded, and I like nice organization. If you're like that, you're going to love Django. So it's great for that. It's all free, it's all open source, and it's constantly being improved and added to. Here's a book I have. Let me look around. This is a book I actually have. That's 3.0. I apparently have the old edition, but the latest must be 3.0. This is a great book for getting started. It says for beginners, which is what I needed. I really like it. It's a guy William S. Vincent wrote this. Interestingly, it's not from a major publishing house. It's a self-published book. What I like about it is, first, it's strangely a very large printed format, and I usually get ebooks, but this was really worth getting because it has sample code. You can go out on the web, get the sample code, step through it step by step. Each chapter starts at the beginning and then does more complexity, and builds up to, using most of the functionality. I did not get it, but I saw there's a more advanced book for this, so probably the follow-up to this book. But I would recommend it especially if you're new to web development or certainly new to Django. This is a good book to get. I do really like it. I will say one of the little caveats when you learn Django is it starts out typically in the tutorials even with, here's your hello world, simple way to do things. And they quickly keep coming back at you and saying, I showed you that way to do it, but don't do it that way. It's a really bad idea. And they give you a slightly better way. Then they scrap that and say, here's a better way. And it's only when you get near the end of the book you start to find the way you probably want to really be coding your apps, which is trying to get a lot, maximizing your reusability, having automatically generated forms, and really getting the true power out of Django. It's a little tedious to go through all those layers, but it's worth it. But if you're already familiar with a lot of things, you may want to kind of jump towards the end of some of this and at least see what you could be doing with the more advanced features. Because I found when I got to the end, I jumped to that, and I don't think I would use some of the earlier approaches, which they don't really recommend anyway. Another book that is worth considering is this one by Django. It's called Django Unleashed. And by the way, the D is not pronounced, just Django. And what I like about this is it gives you a lot more of the conceptual framework. I heard about this book because the author did a presentation on YouTube and he was talking about what he's doing, and they said, by the way, my book's about to come out. This is a really good one. It's not as good for a general simple intro because it's a lot more in depth and gives you a lot more background on what Django's doing and how it works. I do think they're good complementary books, so consider either one, but the first one for beginners is probably a better starting point. Also, the website, there's tutorials, so that's a great place to start. You don't have to wait and get a book. You can jump right in on those tutorials and they will step you through. And it's just a really well supported tool. You can find lots of videos and things on it. Now, Django is sort of the Rolls Royce at high end, everything included, the batteries included and the kitchen sink. Flask is the opposite extreme. It was actually written, I was watching a video, it was almost really more of a joke, like here's an application, and it turned out to be a really useful idea, which was it's just a sort of wrapper that lets you create a web page really quickly. It has very little in terms of built-in tools. There's no batteries included. It's just a very simple app. There's really two good use cases for Flask, in my opinion, and what I can think of. One is you're a very advanced web developer. You're working in a corporation that's already laid out their architecture, their ways of doing things. You already have, maybe you don't want to use Django's ORM, you don't want to do other things, you want to hook in a lot of your own tools. That's where Flask would make a lot of sense. You can do whatever you want to do and extend it the way you want. Very flexible. You're not getting a lot delivered, so you better make sure you have things covered for what you want to bring into it. So that will add some overhead for your work. The other use case, which I see a lot and I hadn't thought of when I first saw Flask, is sometimes people even write Python packages and utilities and they just use Flask to wrapper it, and then they can deploy it as a web page. Pretty cool idea. If you have something simple and you don't need all the complexity of something like Django, then by all means Flask is a good option. Now, when I talk about other options, and I will, there are kind of two extremes, and I hate to call it extremes, but sort of two poles. Django is on one pole, which is high end with lots of things included and structure, and Flask is at the other end, wide open, Wild West, do what you want, but you do have a nice flexible framework, and it's a good tool. So it really, when you figure out what you want to kind of figure where you fall in there and what you want to use. Now, I'm going to talk about Kivi, which is a completely different animal. Kivi is a tool that is designed for developing mobile apps, or a framework for mobile apps. I really like it, but I have to admit I haven't seen any other real options for mobile apps. So this is it for now. A few years ago, you couldn't do mobile apps, at least what I could tell on Python, and Kivi came along and has changed that. So it is a mobile app framework, and because Python can run anywhere, it will run on other devices, which is great. And mostly the big thing it brings is touch interface. So you could write things with the regular Python GUI, but this has the swiping and the dragging and all that stuff you expect on mobile support. It also has many different layout managers to really let you customize the way the screen will get rendered. It'll be very fluid because in a mobile app, you don't know how big it is. Like I've got my phone here. That's a pretty small display. But if I had an iPad, much bigger, and of course on a desktop, even bigger. So that flexibility is really key to something like Kivi. Now you can go here. By the way, let me click on this is the Flask page. You can go here. Lots of documentation. Flask is well documented, so definitely don't ignore that. But I wanted to go to Kivi for a minute. And Kivi has a lot of documentation. I have not seen, for what it's worth, I'm lazy. I talk about lazy a lot. I like layout designers. So when I do even GUI apps and stuff, I like maybe it's because of the Microsoft world where you always had like Visual Studio, you can drag and drop forms. Kivi doesn't really have that yet. I'm not sure it really needs it because it's such a fluid kind of form layout. It would be tricky to really get a very consistent look and feel. But you can see lots of good documentation, lots of plugins, etc. with it. So take a look at that. Kivi is pretty cool. I'm going to jump off here again, get here. All right, so that's Kivi, and I do have a book I'll recommend if you want something to kind of jumpstart with Kivi, which is Kivi Interactive Applications and Games in Python, second edition. Maybe it's a third now, so make sure you get the latest, by Roberto Ulloa. Ulloa. Hopefully I spelled that right. So that's also a book that I like. It helped me get my head around Kivi. Kivi's a little tricky for me because I'm a little more traditional. I'm used to placing things where I want them. And Kivi is very fluid because you have to be on mobile apps. But that's a good book to get you started. Flipping back to Django for a minute. Django is heavily used by sites. So you think, can Django really handle a big website with a lot of complexity? Well, you've got Instagram, Mozilla, Pinterest, NASA, The Onion, all these different sites. So the answer is yes. You can support very large, very complex apps with Django. So it's very robust that way. And I will talk a little more about Django, which is, these are the features you get with it. Object relational mapper, built-in security system, a templating and scripting language, automatic form generation, utilities, built-in dev and web server, and integrated testing support, meaning it's got built-in support so you can test your web pages and your functionality, and a really intensely high inheritance support, so you can always build on top of other things. That's flipping back for a minute. Sorry to kind of flip back and forth, but there's some things to cover. When I talked about Kivi, one of the things I do like a lot about Kivi is that you have a separate file to control your visual layouts. Now, and again, Kivi is strictly for mobile apps, not web apps. Kivi allows you to say, my definition of my buttons and my layouts and everything is in this file, and my behavior code is in a separate script. That's a really good best architecture, best design principle, because you can make changes to your GUI, your visual side, I'll say, that does not affect your behavior, and vice versa. This helps reduce, I think, bugs. It helps keep it clear what your structure of your app is. It's a great idea. Unfortunately, not a lot of examples really support this approach to your application building. Most of the stuff I see online, even the website for Kivi, sends to focus a lot on doing it all within the program. So if you use Tkinter just creates a button within the program, and then you can click on it. It sets properties, but you don't have a separate place to store your Kivi layout for Tkinter layout. In a similar way, although you can do these files, it's an app.kv file. To do that, there's not a huge number of examples to really help you figure out how to do different apps like that. Having said that, the book I recommended does have a lot more in this area and talks a lot more about it. So that's why I like that. Another thing I did want to point out is Kivi has a really nice layout manager setup. You can nest layouts. You can say, I want to use a grid layout. Then I want to, within that, do a box layout. Within that, I want to do this. It has things too that are suggestions, hints, and other times where it's more, assertive. Bear in mind, when you're in a mobile device, you got to give Kivi some flexibility, or you may end up with a really poorly rendered screen. And this is where I think Kivi does a pretty good job. All right, back to web and mobile apps. We've talked about Django and we've talked about Flask, but here's some other honorable mentions or runner-ups. There's TurboGrafx and Bottle, Web2Py, Cubic Web, Giotto, I hope I said that right, Pyramid, and CherryPy. The two I read a fair amount about, I haven't used them, but ones I read quite a bit was Web2Py and Pyramid. Now I saw a video that was dated a year ago that said Web2Py did not support Python 3, but on the documentation now it says they do, so they've changed that, which is great. And Pyramid. Both of these are really good. I would say from what I've read, they are somewhere in the spectrum, from Flask on one side and Django on the other. They fall somewhere in the middle there. So you probably get more configurability, more flexibility possibly than Django. And some of these I believe also focus a little more on performance, which can be a key thing if you're, in a company and you really need that to be quick websites. Now let me talk about the strengths of using Python for web development. One, it's Python. And there's probably very few times I would use the language itself as a key benefit, but because Python can be used for everything and because it does so much, you get great extensibility, you get multi-paradigm support, meaning it can be procedurally coded, it can be just dropped through scripts, it can be done as a object orientation, all these things, a lot of features of Python. Python can be done in very simple mode, but it can also get very sophisticated. So Python itself is a strength. There are comprehensive frameworks out there. The challenge can be just figuring out which one to use, which is one of my bullet points, but you do have some really good framework options. Also, most things with Python are just rapidly improving. So today, maybe it's not looking so good, and tomorrow it's brilliant. They got some great tools. Not that long ago, Python would have been terrible in the data science and AI world. Now, it's killing it. In a similar way, it looks like to me, like especially in web apps, it's doing a great job and it's only getting better. Python has this knack for just sucking out the features of other systems, utilities, and packages and then making them their own. And that's happening very quickly in this area. Ease of maintenance is another thing. If you're going to build websites, it's going to be crucial that you maintain them. So ease of maintenance is a key feature, and Python is all about readability, maintainability. It's got to be very easy to read, and there's a whole set of standards called PEP, which tell people how you write, and it's taken very seriously. I will point out that people talk about there's no static typing in Python. That's changed as of 3.6, and a little bit before that, Python has been adding a lot more support for static typing. It's not enforced in the runtime, but it is enforced when you're reviewing the code. There's a lot of tools out there that will tell you when you're not following the typing that you want to find. So that could be a limitation in Python, but it's not anymore. It's being improved all the time. So that's what I mean about things keep changing. It's highly extensible. Again, Python's strength is just a very highly extensible language, and there's a joke in a Monty Python skit where they're kind of going over the rules of their club, and this one rule keeps coming up over and over again, and I'm kind of playing off that. It's Python, right? This is Ninja is an IDE, and I used their logo, so I thought it only fair that I should mention it's an IDE. It looks pretty cool. I use Spider a lot. I used VS Code, and I use Jupyter Notebooks for data science, but this one looks like a pretty high-powered IDE. So as much as I like Python, everything has its limits. And what's the limits of Python? Let me think as I drink out of my Python mug. I would say Python is like the 5-iron in golfing. You have a whole bunch of clubs, and out of these clubs, you've got the driver, the long club. It's harder to hit with. It can take you from teeing off to the green if you're a professional golfer. I'm not. I can't hit like that no matter what I do. But that's one type of club. And then you have other ones that are like the pitching wedge, and you have other clubs that are, for putting and really close. But if you think of like the 5-iron, it's in the middle, and it can do 80% of your golf game. And it's not going to do a perfect job doing the 80%, but it's sort of good enough. And I would say Python is better than just good enough. But the idea I want to convey is it's not a custom fit for everything, but it can do pretty much everything. You can use it. So let me kind of talk about some of this. The one thing I've noticed about using Python for web app and even mobile app development is deployments are not as clean and thought out, it seems, as in some other languages. I think that's because it's evolving quickly. It's not just drag and drop and click. Sometimes there's some manual tweaking and some pieces. So take a look at that and make sure you have a handle on how you would deploy your app. I would recommend with this, do a proof of concept, do a little mini app, flesh out a few things, and get a feel for it if it makes sense for you. There's also, in anything with Python, potential performance bottlenecks. So look at that. My advice would be find out, most apps really don't have to be awesomely fast all the time. Obviously, web apps, you want really quick responses to the web page, but you could be doing things in the back end while the web page is just displaying, etc. Find out where your bottlenecks are crucial. If you've got something that's going to be like doing some sort of an animation or something that's going to require really quick responses, then look at that and see how you would overcome them. I'm a big believer in sort of finding the trouble spots before you get to them and thinking out where they might be, because there's usually solutions. Maybe you write something in C++ or something else, or you just find a package that will help you, but it's a good idea to identify that. It may also affect the web framework you choose. Generally, Python does not run in a browser. Now, there is a package I mentioned that will translate Python into JavaScript and let it run, and I think there's a lot of promise there. It seems to work pretty well, but be aware that it is not JavaScript in that sense, so it's a bit of a limitation. Selecting the best framework can be a challenge. I've given you some ideas. There are more frameworks that I didn't even talk about. You can take a look at those. I tried to pick the ones that seem to be the most popular. A big thing to be cautious of is that web framework being actively supported and added to, enhanced, improved, etc. There's always a risk with open source products or any product that maintenance has kind of fallen by the wayside, and you don't want to pick a framework that hasn't been touched by coders in 10 years, no improvements. You'll eventually get burned if you do that. So Django and Flask are certainly very active ones, but take a look at the other ones because they seem to be, most of those are also being enhanced and maintained. Beware of Python criticisms. There are sort of two camps of Python. Python is oddly a bit of a divisive language at times. Some people feel like Python is just being promoted way too much hype. But other people tend to be, I think, overly critical. And they haven't really necessarily looked at it closely enough. And they say, you can't do this and you can't do this. For instance, obviously, just a few years ago, you could have said, you cannot do data typing. It only does dynamic data typing, and you can't do strict data typing. And that's changed, and it's changing more. 10 years ago, you would have said you can't do mobile apps. That's changed. So be aware that things are changing constantly, and be cautious of criticisms of Python. Consider the source. Is this somebody who really uses and likes Python but is being honest, or is there a bit of a bias there? Because you can get both. So wrapping up, we talked about frameworks. What frameworks are, that they jumpstart you, they give you services, they give you an overall structure, and they give you a sort of paradigm or a way to look at the application and the architecture so that you can conceptually get your head around it and know how your code is plugging into it. It's very key. And we saw that Python has many web app frameworks and one for mobile apps, but basically you've got the frameworks, and now the question becomes, which do you want to use? There's a high end, everything included, Django, and the other end, less included but a lot more flexibility, Flask, and then everything in between. mobile app support is evolving. So while Kivi is pretty much it for now, I think Kivi is improving rapidly and it seems to be getting a lot of support. So I think it's going to be a good story in the long run, and it's pretty cool, and it's Python, right? I want you to leave with the feeling, hopefully you agree, that Python is a good choice for web apps. Mobile apps, I think you do have to look more closely at because it is only one choice. But from what I'm seeing, it's a really good choice for web app development. So hopefully you agree with that. And I want to thank you. Please like, share with people, let people know what you liked about this. Find any videos I like. I appreciate people sharing, get the word out. And of course, subscribe so you'll get notified of all my newer videos. And some of them coming up are going to be adding on to this particular series. Thank you.